Everyone laughed at him for covering his cabin with stones, but in the winter, everyone asked for his help. Silas Miller was the kind of man who didn't waste time explaining what he did because he knew no one would understand anyway. And for months on end, as he carried stone after stone from the riverbed to the lot next to his home in a small village nestled between mountains in the Rockies, he endured laughter, remarks, and sideways glances without ever opening his mouth to defend himself. It was precisely for that reason that, when the harshest winter in 50 years swept down from the mountains and froze even the hope of the residents who had laughed so much, the first thing those people did was knock on the door of Silas's stone cabin. But to understand how that night came to be, you need to go back a few months earlier, to a spring afternoon when Silas came home from work with his hands dirty from the soil and went straight to the wooden box he kept under his bed ever since his grandfather had passed away. The box was old with rusty hinges and wood stained by moisture. Inside it was a single item, a hardcover notebook yellowed with age, its pages filled with handwritten notes in small, slanted lettering. It was the notebook of his grandfather, Thomas. And that day, for the first time since the old man's funeral 3 years before, Silas opened the notebook to the first page and began to read with the attention of someone deciphering a map. Thomas Miller had been a kind of silent sage. He wasn't a man of school, but he was a man of observation. He had spent his entire life studying how the oldest houses in the region behaved in the cold, why some held the heat while others yielded to the wind like wet paper. And in the pages of that notebook were recorded years of observation, trial and error, conversations with people even older than him, and simple but precise calculations about wall thickness, stone type, stove placement, and heat circulation. Silas read for hours that night. When he looked up from the notebook, it was dark outside, and the lamp on the table was down to its last drop of kerosene. But something inside him had changed. It was as if his grandfather's words had awakened a certainty that he had carried for years without knowing how to name it. The next day he woke up before sunrise and went to the river. The natural quarry at the bottom of the slope was known to everyone in the village. Children played there in the summer, men fished on the banks in the late afternoons. No one, however, had thought to use those stones to build anything. They were heavy, irregular, hard to transport. Silas spent the whole morning picking the best stones, stacking them by the riverbank, and in the afternoon he began carrying the first ones in the wheelbarrow he had fixed himself 2 weeks earlier, as if he already knew he was going to need it. It was Old Man Joe, the owner of the general store, who first stopped to ask what was going on. "Silas, are you hauling stones from the river?" "What for?" "To build," he replied, without stopping walking. Old Man Joe stared for a moment, shook his head, and went back inside the store. That same afternoon, he had already told at least 5 people that Silas Miller was hauling stones from the river for no apparent reason. The village of Stone Hollow was small enough that any news would spread by word of mouth before dinner. It had just over 300 families, all scattered between the southern slope of the mountain and the valley where the river ran. Most of the houses were made of wood, built in the same style the first inhabitants had brought with them when they arrived in the region many decades ago. It was a tradition that no one questioned, because it worked reasonably well most of the time, and no one had the inclination to change what was already established. Silas was different from the others in that regard. He had never been the type to accept things just because they'd always been that way. From an early age, he had inherited from his grandfather not only his quiet manners, but also that way of looking at the world with a productive suspicion, as if the reality everyone saw was just the surface of something deeper that was yet to be understood. He was 42 years old, with broad shoulders from a lifetime of working with his own hands, and a face that didn't give much away. He always wore the dark green jacket he'd bought in a neighboring town a few years back, and the heavy leather boots that were practically an extension of his feet. The people in the village knew his step, his rhythm, his silence. And it was precisely that silence that started to bother them when the stones began appearing around his home. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us folks who are just starting out a lot now continuing. During the first week, the stones kept piling up around the base of Silas's cabin. He worked alone, with a meticulousness that seemed almost religious. He chose each stone carefully, examined the surfaces, tested the fit before setting it with a mixture of clay, sand and straw he prepared in a wooden basin. His grandfather's notebook lay open on the bench inside the house, and several times a day he'd go in to check some notes, come out again, and resume work with a focused expression that didn't invite questions. But the questions came anyway. The first one was from Mrs. Gertrude, who lived across the street and had completely lost her inhibitions with old age. "Silas, what are you doing with all those stones?" "Lining the walls," he answered, setting a stone in place with a dull thud. "Lining them for what? The wooden walls are good enough?" "Good enough for what?" She was at a loss for a moment, then waved her hand in the air as if shooing a fly, and went away muttering. But it was Gertrude who first used the word madness out loud, at a group of women drinking hot cider on Dorothy's porch the following afternoon, and the word travelled through the village the way all words carrying a judgment do. Silas heard the whispers when he passed by the general store, saw the exchanged glances when he stopped to buy supplies. He never reacted. He'd go home, put on his green jacket, grab his gloves, and get back to the stones. It was on a windy afternoon, when he was in the middle of a tricky section of the east wall, that old man Sterling showed up. Sterling Vance was 63 years old and the most influential man in the village, not out of kindness, but through accumulation. Over the decades, he had bought up land, leased plots, and created a network of dependencies that tied most of the residents to him one way or another. He was tall, stout, with a neatly trimmed grey moustache and a voice that tended to fill a room without any effort. He liked dramatic arrivals and memorable exits. He showed up with his hands in his pockets and just stood there watching for a good while before speaking. "Silas, what's all this about?" "Building." "Building what? A wall?" "Lining. On the outside walls." Sterling stepped forward, examined the stones with an expression that mixed disdain with genuine curiosity, and then let out a short, dry laugh. "Son, you're wasting your time with this. Do you know how much weight this will put on your cabin structure? It'll all give way in the first winter." "It won't," Silas said without looking up. "How do you know?" "Because I calculated it." Sterling stared at him for a moment. Then he shook his head with an expression that said more than any further comment and walked away. But before turning the corner, he still spoke over his shoulder. "Everyone in town is laughing at you, Miller. Only I feel sorry for you. I'm trying to help you." Silas didn't respond. He kept laying the stones. But that sentence kept circling in his head more than he wanted to admit. Not because Sterling was right, but because there was a partial truth there that hurt more than the wrong part. Everyone was indeed laughing, and he knew it. What Sterling didn't know, and what no one in the village knew besides his mother, was the real reason Silas was doing that. It wasn't stubbornness, though it seemed like it. It wasn't vanity, though it could be mistaken for that. It was a promise. 3 years earlier, when Grandfather Thomas was in his final days, he had called Silas close and held his hand with a surprising strength for a man so frail. "This notebook is yours now," the old man said, in a voice that came out in thin strands. "But it's no good just kept away. It's meant to be used. Grandpa, I'll take good care of it." "No. I'm not talking about keeping it. I'm talking about using it. You need to build that cabin, Silas, just like it's drawn there. It's not a fantasy, it's a necessity. One day this cold will do what it's never done, and when that happens, those walls will be the difference between suffocation and shelter." Silas had promised, and he was a man of his word. The problem was that the promise had a cost he hadn't fully foreseen, the cost of isolation, and that weight grew as the weeks passed. Mrs. Martha, his mother, lived in a little house 200 yards from his. She was 71, with health that came and went like the tide, and a love for her son that sometimes showed itself in ways that seemed more like worry than affection. But it was love just the same. On a late Wednesday afternoon, she sent word with the neighbor Mabel that she needed to talk to him. Silas went. He found his mother sitting in the kitchen with her hands folded on the table in a posture he'd known since he was a child. It was her way of preparing to say something difficult. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "Silas, I need you to stop this stone business." He didn't respond immediately. He looked at his mother's hands, which bore the same marks of time as his grandfather's. "Mom, let me talk. People are saying you've lost your mind. That you're obsessed with your grandfather's notebook, that you're going to put the cabin's structure at risk. Old Man Sterling went to Old Man Joe at the general store yesterday and said he's going to take you to the Homeowners Association." That was a surprise. Silas lifted his eyes. "What did he say?" "That your stones are a risk to the community, that if they fall, they'll hit Clifford's cabin next door." "That's a lie, and he knows it." "I know it's a lie, son, but the people don't. And people listen to Sterling because they're afraid to contradict him." Martha paused, running her fingers along the edge of the table. "I know you made a promise to your grandfather, I know. But your grandfather also didn't want you to become a laughingstock. He wanted you to be happy." "I'll be happy when I finish what I started." "Silas." "Mum." He said this with a gentleness that cut deeper than if he had shouted. "I understand what you're feeling, but I can't stop. It's not stubbornness, it's not pride. It's that I know this winter will be different," the old man told me, and his notebook confirms it. "The mountains have been sending signs for weeks." Martha was silent for a long time. Then she sighed, stood up, and went to the stove. "You're having dinner here," she said. It was a statement, not a question, and there was a surrender in it that hurt on both sides. Silas had dinner, helped wash the dishes, and went home in the dark. On the way, he stopped for a moment and looked at the walls of his cabin. In the glow of the full moon, the stones shimmered with a bluish-grey tone that had something ancient, resilient, permanent about them. And he felt, for a fleeting moment, a peace that rarely visited him. But the peace didn't last long. The following week, Sterling made good on his word. A formal summons from the Homeowners Association was delivered to the door of Silas's cabin on a Tuesday morning. He was required to attend a meeting on Friday night where the community would discuss the structural risks of ongoing irregular construction on Lot 14. Silas read the paper twice, folded it, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. The meeting would be held in the association hall, a wooden shed with bench seating and a large table at the front. When Silas arrived on Friday night, the place was nearly full. There were at least 80 people. He recognized practically every face. Some looked away as he entered. Others stared at him with an expression hard to decipher. Sterling was seated at the front table beside Arthur, the association president, a middle-aged man with the unfortunate combination of being honest but insecure. Next to Sterling sat two residents Silas knew by sight, the brothers Douglas and Augustus, who leased land from Sterling and rarely did anything contrary to their boss. "You can sit down, Silas," Arthur said, pointing to a chair in front. He sat down. He felt every gaze settle on him like a physical weight. Arthur read out the reason for the meeting in a loud voice, with that formal manner he used when he wanted to seem more authoritative than he felt. Sterling listened with his arms crossed, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. After Arthur finished, he asked for someone to present the concerns. Douglas raised his hand and began to talk about the weight of the stones on the structure, about the risk of collapse, about the proximity to the neighbor's cabin. It was a speech that had clearly been prepared beforehand, with details that Douglas alone would never know. Silas waited for the speech to end. Then he raised his hand and asked to speak. "Go ahead," Arthur said. He stood up, took his grandfather's notebook from the backpack he had brought, and placed it on the table. He opened it to the page where Thomas had made the load and thickness calculations. "This notebook belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Miller," he said in a calm voice that reached every corner of the hall. "He spent his whole life studying construction, not in school, observing, testing, talking to people even older than him. Inside here are the exact calculations of how much weight my cabin's structure can support, and I can guarantee you all that what I'm doing poses no risk to anyone." "With all due respect, Silas," Sterling said, opening his mouth for the first time, "your grandfather wasn't an engineer. His notebook, however nice it might be, carries no technical validity. A general murmur arose. Arthur tapped lightly on the table to ask for silence. "Do you have any professional who can confirm the safety of the construction?" Arthur asked. Silas looked at him. He knew the honest answer at that moment was no. He didn't, not yet. And that absence weighed in the room like a stone he himself had carried. "Not at the moment," he said, "but I'll arrange it." Sterling didn't smile, but his eyes did something similar. The meeting ended with a 30-day deadline for Silas to present a technical report or suspend the construction. He left the hall without speaking to anyone and went home in the darkness of the night with the notebook under his arm. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold without him touching it, Silas thought for the first time seriously about the possibility that he had promised his grandfather something he couldn't fulfill. Not because the stones were wrong, but because the world was bigger than the notebook. The turning point came from a place he didn't expect. It was Clara Jenkins who, without knowing it, had planted the seed. Clara was 38 years old, a teacher for the younger children at the village school, and had moved to Stone Hollow 5 years ago after a relationship that hadn't worked out in a larger town. She had dark hair at shoulder length, a direct way of speaking that some people mistook for harshness, and a genuine curiosity that made her read a lot and listen attentively. In recent months, she had developed the habit of greeting Silas with a nod when she passed him on the street, and on 3 or 4 occasions they had exchanged a few short words that lingered in the air for too long. After the Homeowners Association meeting, Clara went 2 days without appearing near Silas's cabin. It was a sign he noticed more than he would have liked, but on the afternoon of the 3rd day, she showed up with a sheet of paper in her hand. "I've been thinking," she said without much introduction. "Your grandfather used these techniques because he learned them from someone, right? From his father and other older folks. So there's a tradition behind it, a tradition that someone at some point formally studied." She held out the paper. "This is the name of a teacher who taught around here many years ago. He was my instructor in a regional history workshop I took when I first arrived. He knows everything about old construction in this area. If anyone can read that notebook and understand what your grandfather calculated, it's him." Silas looked at the paper. It read, "Arthur Whitaker, retired professor, lives in the Clear Creek district." "How did you know I needed this?" Clara crossed her arms lightly, but not in a closed-off way. It was more like someone shielding themselves from something they aren't quite sure of. "Because I saw your expression when you left the meeting," she said. "And because everyone who goes to that meeting with that look is usually right about something the others haven't seen yet." She turned her back and left before he could respond. Silas stared at the paper for a long time. Then he tucked it into his jacket pocket, next to the folded association summons. The next day he woke up before 5 in the morning, put on his green jacket, laced up his boots, and began walking toward the Clear Creek district. The walk took nearly 3 hours along the dirt road that wound through the pine trees. The morning air was cold and dry, and the sky had that pale blue shade that precedes the strong sun. Silas walked at a steady pace, like someone used to covering distances without hurry, but with purpose. The Clear Creek district was little more than a handful of houses around a small square with a wooden gazebo in the center. Silas asked a man sweeping the sidewalk where Professor Arthur lived, and the man pointed to a brick house with a vegetable garden in front and windows always open. Arthur Whitaker was 76 years old, but his eyes had the quickness of someone 30 years younger. He was thin, with a posture that suggested he had spent his life over drafting boards and notebooks, and his hands looked like those of someone who still works with them even after retirement. When Silas knocked on the door, the old man appeared in a leather apron with an expression that showed he wasn't easily surprised. "Are you Professor Arthur?" "I am. And who are you?" "Silas Miller, from Stone Hollow." The name didn't provoke any immediate reaction, but Arthur examined him for a moment with those sharp eyes. "Come in," he said. The inside of the house was exactly what Silas had imagined. Walls covered with shelves of books, technical drawing tubes leaning in the corners, a large table with papers scattered about, and 2 cups suggesting the professor had already had a visitor earlier that day. There was also a lit fireplace in the corner, and the place smelled of burnt wood and old paper. Silas pulled the notebook out of his backpack and placed it on the table without preamble. "It was my grandfather's. I need someone who understands what he calculated here. Arthur sat down, picked up the notebook, and began flipping through it. He didn't say anything for a long time. The pages turned slowly under his fingers, and there was an expression on the old man's face that Silas couldn't fully decipher. It was somewhere between recognition and surprise, like someone finding something in an unexpected place that they had been searching for a long time. "What was your grandfather's name?" he asked without looking up. "Thomas Miller." The teacher stopped flipping through. He stared at the open page for a long time. Then he looked up at Silas with an expression that was now more direct. "Thomas Miller from Stone Hollow?" "Yes." Arthur closed the notebook carefully and held it with both hands like someone holding something that felt heavier than it looked. "I knew your grandfather," he said. Silas felt something tighten in his chest. "What do you mean?" "It was many years ago. I was a young teacher, new to the area, doing a survey of traditional building techniques for a research project. Your grandfather was one of the sharpest I ever interviewed. He knew things I had never seen described in any book. I asked to copy his notes, but he said he preferred to keep them. He said one day someone in the family would actually use that knowledge." He paused. "I imagine that someone is you." The silence that settled between them carried a particular weight. It was the kind of silence that happens when the world makes a connection that seems too big to be an accident, yet too small to be called fate. "Can you give me a document confirming the building is safe?" Silas asked, his voice coming out lower than he intended. "I can do more than that," Arthur said. "I can go in person." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Arthur arrived at Stone Hollow 2 days later, on a Monday morning, with a small notebook in his jacket pocket and a patience that seemed bottomless. He spent over 2 hours examining Silas's construction, touching the walls, measuring thicknesses with a tape, consulting the grandfather's notebook, and doing calculations on a piece of paper. Silas stayed close the whole time, but didn't interfere. When the teacher finished, he had an expression that could only be described as restrained admiration. "Silas, I can tell you with absolute certainty that this structure poses no risk at all. Quite the opposite." He looked at the stone walls with that technical gaze that didn't hide what lay behind it. "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. The arrangement of the stones, the mortar, the thickness calculated according to the type of rock available in the creek. This is knowledge accumulated over generations. No written manual surpasses this kind of experience." "Can you put that in writing? The Homeowners Association gave me a deadline." "Yes, I can." Arthur spent the afternoon sitting at Silas's kitchen table, writing with the steady, firm handwriting of someone who had spent decades evaluating work. The document he produced wasn't long, but it was precise. It described the technique used, compared it to traditional constructions in the region that had withstood generations of winters, and concluded with a clear statement that the ongoing work was structurally sound and technically grounded. Silas read the document twice, folded it carefully, and stored it with his grandfather's notebook. At the next association meeting, he handed the document to Arthur without saying a word. Arthur read it, passed it to the other members at the table, and then looked at Sterling. Sterling read it too. He was silent for a moment longer than usual, with an expression hovering somewhere between restrained anger and poorly digested defeat. "That settles it," Arthur said. "It does," Sterling agreed in a flat voice that revealed nothing. But as people filed out of the hall, Silas saw Sterling speaking in low tones to the brothers Douglas and Augustus near the door. He couldn't hear what was said, but the way the three of them looked at him before leaving made it clear the matter wasn't settled. And indeed it wasn't. The following week, stories began to circulate that Silas hadn't told and that weren't true. That the stones had cracked the neighbor's wall, that the mortar was coming loose, that the weight had caused the floor to give way. None of these things had happened, but the stories spread with the specific speed of lies that people are willing to believe because they confirm what they've already decided to feel. The neighbor Clifford, whose lot was next to Silas's, was the first to be approached with these stories. He was a quiet man in his 50s, who had never been anyone's friend or enemy in particular. But when Douglas came to him one afternoon, saying he had noticed a crack in the wall of Clifford's cabin that must have something to do with the weight of the neighbor's stones, Clifford got worried enough to examine his own walls with an anxious expression. Silas found out about this from Clara, who had overheard the conversation from a distance while passing by on her way to school. "Clifford went to look at his wall," she said, when she showed up that same Friday afternoon. "He hasn't said anything to you yet, but he's worried." "I know." Silas had noticed the neighbor was avoiding crossing paths with him. "You should go talk to him." "I've thought about that." "Then go today. Don't let the weekend pass. These stories grow when they go unanswered." There was a frankness in the way Clara spoke that Silas deeply respected, even when that frankness pointed to things he'd rather not have to do. He went to Clifford's cabin that afternoon. The neighbor opened the door with a slightly uncomfortable expression. "Clifford, can I come in?" The man hesitated, then stepped back and cleared the way. The conversation was difficult at first, because Clifford didn't know how to say what he felt without seeming accusatory, and Silas didn't know how to approach it without sounding defensive. But after a few minutes of dancing around it, something gave way, and Clifford got straight to the point. "I was told your stones might be putting pressure on my wall." "Who told you that?" "Douglas. Douglas works for Sterling." Silas said this without anger, as one stating a fact. "Come outside with me." They went to the side wall of Clifford's cabin and examined every inch. There was no crack at all. The wood was intact, dry, well preserved. Silas pointed to the space between the two structures and explained, with patience and using the words from his grandfather's notebook, why the technique he used didn't exert lateral pressure on neighboring structures. Clifford listened attentively. When Silas finished, the man was silent for a while. "I should have come to talk to you first," Clifford said. "No, it makes sense that you were worried. Anyone would be. But I should have asked you first before I let myself worry about what others say." They were silent for a moment. Then Clifford extended his hand. Silas shook it. It was a simple masculine gesture that meant more than it seemed. But the act from Sterling that weighed most heavily wasn't any lie about cracked walls. It was something more subtle and therefore harder to fight. There was a tradition in the village of a work bee whenever someone needed to do a bigger job, fix a roof, fence a pasture, prepare the fields. The neighbors would arrive early with their tools and work together all day. It was one of the things Silas appreciated most about life in Stone Hollow, that old-fashioned spirit of cooperation that towns had lost. But when the roof of Mrs. Martha's house, his mother, needed to be redone after a storm tore off some panels, nobody showed up. Silas had mentioned the situation in passing to two neighbors, as was the custom. Normally that was enough, but on the morning of the day that had been implicitly agreed upon, he went to his mother's cabin and found no one there but himself. Mrs. Martha was at the window with an expression that tried to hide how much it stung. "You didn't need to call anyone, son. We can handle it on our own." "I know we can, but it shouldn't have to be like this." He worked on his mother's roof all day, alone. It was a 3-person job done by one. When he finished, his back aching and his hands raw from the straw, he climbed down the ladder and found Martha in the kitchen, her eyes red, but her chin held high. "It looks good," she said. "It does. You're going to eat something." He ate. And as he ate, he felt for the first time in that whole process a different kind of crack. Not in the walls, not in the structure, inside himself. It was a weariness that didn't come from his muscles. It came from a deeper place, where the things we endure because we decide they're worth it are stored, but which sometimes gets too heavy to hide. After dinner, Martha sat beside her son and was silent for a while. Then she said, "Are you okay?" "I am." "No, you're not." He didn't answer. She continued, "I know I asked you to stop, and I know it was wrong of me. Your grandfather was the kind of man who saw things before others did, and you inherited that from him. I'm afraid it'll cost you dearly, that's all. But I never should have asked you to break a promise." Silas looked at his mother. She rarely acknowledged when she had overdone a worry. The fact that she was doing it now said something about how much that day had weighed on her, too. "It wasn't wrong, Mom. You were scared for me." "I am scared. I still am." But I'm on your side. I want you to know that." He stood up, hugged his mother from behind while she was still seated, and stayed like that for a moment that seemed to compress time. "I know," he said. Clara found out about the roof the next day. She didn't say anything at the time, but 2 days later she showed up at Silas's door with a determined expression and a list written on a piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "It's a list of people I've talked to who are willing to show up for the next community workday at your mother's if needed." Silas stared at the paper. There were 6 names. "You went and talked to these people?" "I did." "Why?" She crossed her arms lightly again, with that gesture he had already learned to recognize as part of her way of positioning herself in the world. "Because what happened was unfair, and because most of these people wouldn't have stayed away if they hadn't been pressured into it. Deep down, they know it was wrong." Silas was silent for a moment. Then, "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to. I wanted to." She paused for exactly the right amount of time. "Those are different things." She left. Silas held the paper in his hand for a long time. Something had shifted between them in those days. It was too subtle to name easily, but it was there. It was the kind of thing that grows between 2 people when they keep seeing each other on the right side of difficult situations. But Silas had an uncomfortable clarity about the fact that anything that might bloom there needed to wait. Not out of artificial caution, but because he was still in the middle of something that demanded all his attention, and because there was a part of him that knew that when winter came, some things would become much clearer than they were now. Autumn arrived with signs that those who knew those mountains recognized immediately. It wasn't just the cold, it was the quality of the cold. It was the way the wind came from a different angle than usual, carrying a scent of snow that arrived before the snow itself. It was the thickness of the ice on the puddles in the morning. It was the behavior of the animals, which sought shelter earlier than in previous years. Silas had grown up in those mountains. His grandfather had spent decades observing these same signs, and the notebook had entire pages on how to recognize when a winter would be different. That winter would be different. He finished the exterior wall cladding with an urgency he had kept in check until then. Each stone was laid with extra care. The mortar was reinforced with a process that his grandfather described in detail on a page with a note in the margin that read, "For the winters, the mountain saves up to collect." The wood stove had already been installed since the previous month, but the duct system that distributed heat through the walls was the most complex part of the entire construction, and it took the longest. The grandfather's notebook described the principle clearly, but the practical implementation required Silas to test and adjust for weeks. There were nights when the smoke didn't go out the right place, others when the heat escaped before completing the circuit. He adjusted, tested again, adjusted again. Arthur, who had returned to the Clear Creek district, received letters with drawings and technical questions. He always replied within 2 days, with explanations that sometimes opened new paths and sometimes confirmed what Silas had already figured out on his own. It was an exchange both seemed to appreciate without having to name it. Clara spent a whole afternoon at the cabin, examining the duct system, with a curiosity she herself explained as educational, because one day I'm going to teach this to the kids. "You're going to teach construction to 6-year-olds?" Silas asked. "I'm going to teach them that there are old kinds of knowledge worth more than a lot of new things," she said. "It's not about construction, it's about how we learn." Silas stared at her for a moment. It was one of those moments when a person says something seemingly simple and you realize there's a much larger structure of thought behind it. "You think a lot about teaching," he said. "I think about how things reach people." She examined the joint of a duct with the wall, ran her finger over the mortar. "Your grandfather didn't go to school to learn this. Someone showed him. He watched. He experimented. That's teaching too. Maybe the most honest kind there is." There was something there that Silas took to bed that night, and that was still present when he woke up in the morning. Not the phrase itself, but what it revealed about who had said it. Winter began gently, as it usually does before showing its true face. The first weeks of cold were bearable, almost mild. The children ran in the fresh snow. The adults enjoyed the colder mornings by sitting near the stove with hot cider. Life in the village went on at its normal pace. Sterling had bought a new generator and made a point of mentioning it in every conversation, like someone announcing a protection others wouldn't have. Silas finished the last adjustments on the cabin while the cold was still mild. When he lit the stove for the first time with all the connections sealed and working as they should, he sat in the center of the room for an hour, eyes closed, feeling the heat spread through the walls and return. It was exactly as his grandfather had described. The stone absorbed and gave back. It wasn't the heat of a nearby flame. It was the heat of a hug that came from far away and arrived slowly. Mrs. Martha was the first person Silas invited to see it. She walked in slowly, with the carefulness of someone who has a lifetime of experience in not showing reactions before understanding them. She stood in the center of the room for a moment, then she ran her hand over the stone wall. "It's warm," she said in a small voice. "It is. The stone wall is warm. It absorbs heat from the internal duct for hours and gives it back later. That's what the old man called the stone's memory." Martha fell silent. Then she turned to her son with an expression he had rarely seen on her face. It was something between pride and regret, a mixture that eyes sometimes express more precisely than any words. "Your grandfather would be very happy," she said. Silas didn't answer, but he swallowed something that had risen without warning. The turn of winter happened on a Monday night. No one predicted exactly when, but the signs had been there for days for those who knew how to read them. The wind changed direction on Sunday afternoon. The thermometer on Silas's porch had recorded a drop of nearly 12 degrees between noon and late afternoon. The sky had that dull grey that doesn't look like a cloud, but like a wall. In the early hours of Monday, the temperature plummeted. Silas was awake. He had lit the stove 2 hours earlier, not out of immediate need but out of instinct. While the rest of the village slept, he sat by the stove with his grandfather's notebook open on his lap, reading the final pages he had never gotten around to finishing. They were later notes with handwriting that already showed the tremor of old age, but the observations were the same as always, precise, direct, without ornament. And on one of the last pages, in letters slightly larger than usual, it was written, "The cold is not an enemy. The cold is a teacher. It teaches who built to last and who built to look good. The stone knows the difference." Silas stared at those lines for a long time. Then he closed the notebook, went to the window, and looked outside. Snow was falling in large, silent flakes. The wind had died down, which paradoxically was more worrying. The drop in wind in that kind of cold wasn't calm. It was the cold concentrating. Before 5 in the morning, he heard the first noise in the street. It was a child crying outside. He opened the door and saw in the snow that already covered the ground more than a handspan deep, a girl of about 8 years old with a thin jacket and a blanket around her shoulders. Behind her, approaching with quick, desperate steps, was her grandmother, Grammy Rose, a woman of nearly 70 whom Silas knew by sight. "Silas, for the love of God," Rose said, her voice trembling from both the cold and something else. "Our cabin can't take it. The fire went out. I can't light it again, and the little one's been shivering for an hour." He stepped back from the door without saying a word. "Come in." The warmth that enveloped them when they crossed the threshold was of a different order than they expected. The little girl stopped crying almost immediately. Rose stood in the center of the room for a few seconds with an expression that was hard to see without feeling something. "My God," she whispered. "Sit by the stove. I'll heat up some water." In the following minutes, more people arrived. First came Clifford, who showed up with his wife and a bag of supplies, explaining that the bedroom window had given way and the cold was pouring in non-stop. Then Mrs. Margaret arrived, a 65-year-old woman who had lived alone since her husband passed away years ago, bringing only a blanket wrapped in her arms as if it were a baby. Then the Sullivans came, a family of 4 with 2 teenage children who helped their parents carry the most necessary things, while the father explained that the floor of their cabin had started to ice over from underneath the boards. Every time someone new crossed the door, Silas stepped back to make room and gave a simple nod of invitation. There were no speeches, no comments about what had been said months before. There was only that open door and the warmth on the other side. The cabin wasn't big. With 10, then 15, then 20 people inside, the space got tight. Sleeping mats were spread on the floor. Blankets were borrowed from the stash Silas had put together at the start of fall, as if he had known he'd need them for more than just himself. Water was heated on the stove and poured into cups and mugs. The kids were quiet, which was the clearest sign that the cold had been frightening enough to sober everyone up. Mrs. Martha arrived around 6 in the morning, brought by Clifford, who had stopped by her place on the way. When she walked in and saw the state of things, she didn't say a word. She went straight to the kitchen and started helping Silas sort out the food. "You got flour?" she asked. "I do." "Eggs?" "A few." "Then there'll be cornbread for these folks in the morning." That was what Martha did in moments of pressure. She cooked, and by cooking, she created a sense of normalcy that people needed more than they realized. The night went on, the wind picked up again outside, and there were moments when you could hear the pines creaking on the slopes. But inside the stone cabin, the warmth held steady, not the frantic heat of a big fire. It was the constant, distributed warmth that came from the walls and the floor and the low ceiling. It was the warmth the stone had stored for weeks, and now gave back as promised. It was around 7 in the morning that Sterling arrived. Silas was at the door helping a family that had just shown up get inside with their kids. That's when he saw Sterling across the street, standing in the snow, wearing his heaviest coat and an expression he had cultivated his whole life to show no weakness. The generator had died the night before. Without power, without electric heat, Sterling's house had cooled down with the same ruthless speed as all the others. The two men looked at each other for a moment across the snow-covered space. Sterling said nothing. He stood there with his hat in his hand, literally, the hat he never took off, which was almost his trademark. There was a humiliation in that moment that he was carrying, and everyone watching could see it. But there was also something underneath it, exhaustion, a reality the cold had made impossible to ignore. Silas looked at the man for a moment. He thought about everything that had happened in the past months. The meetings, the lies about the walls, the community work that never came, the stares behind his back. Then he stepped away from the door and gave a nod. "You can come in." Sterling crossed the street and entered. There was no speech, no payback, no moment of dramatic confrontation that maybe some folks inside that cabin were expecting. Silas simply went back to what he was doing, and Sterling found a spot near the wall and sat down there, in silence, in a place where the warmth was greater than the shame. The hours crawled by slowly. Around 10 in the morning, the sun began to peek through the clouds, which didn't change the temperature, but did change the quality of the light. The kids started talking more. The adults relaxed their shoulders. Miss Martha's cornbread went around on makeshift plates, and not a crumb was left. It was Clara who arrived around noon, with a large bag and a look that swept over the scene with that quick, analytical gaze that was part of her nature. "I brought more supplies," she said, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. Then she stood still for a moment, looking at the space full of people, at the stone walls, at the stove burning without pause. "It worked exactly like you said it would." "That was your grandfather," Silas replied, "but you were the one who made it happen." There was a difference between these two things that neither of them needed to spell out for it to be understood. The storm continued for 2 more days, and for 2 whole days, Silas's stone cabin was the only truly warm place in Stone Hollow. Families took turns. Some stayed for a few hours, warmed up, went back to check on their own homes, and sometimes returned. Others stayed longer. Mrs. Margaret, who lived alone and whose cabin had suffered the most damage, stayed almost the entire time. She and Mrs. Martha started working together in the kitchen with the natural efficiency of people who understand each other without needing to say much. The revelation that shook everything came on the afternoon of the 2nd day. Silas was helping rearrange the sleeping mats when Sterling approached and stopped a short distance away, like someone calculating something. "Silas." He turned around. Sterling didn't have the look of someone about to give a speech. He had the look of someone who's been carrying something heavy for too long and is tired of the weight. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for what I did, for the meeting, for the stories I spread, for the work bee that never showed up." Silas stayed silent. "I know this doesn't fix anything," Sterling continued. and I know you don't have to accept it, but I needed to say it. There were people nearby who could hear. The hall imposes its own terms. Sterling must have known that, and that's what made the gesture harder to ignore. He had chosen to say it in public, in a space where pride couldn't hide behind closed doors. Silas looked at the man for a longer moment. Then he said, "I accept it, that's all." There was no list of conditions, no further comment. "I accept it," and he went back to what he was doing. Sterling stood still for a moment, like someone processing something. Then he went outside to get firewood to stock the pile near the stove. He worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon, doing what needed to be done without asking for recognition. The storm passed on the morning of the third day. When the clouds broke, and the sun returned with that specific force of the winter sun that doesn't warm, but illuminates with a clarity that feels new, people began to drift out, little by little. Some went to check on their own houses, others to help neighbors remove snow from roofs. Others simply stood in front of Silas's cabin, breathing the cold morning air with a relief that had something solemn about it. Silas stood in the doorway, in his green jacket, watching the village organize itself around its own crisis. The mountains in the background were covered in white, the pines bent under the weight of the snow, and along the streets there were tracks that told, without words, the story of the past 2 days. Clara stayed until the end, after most people had left. She was helping Martha fold the blankets when Silas came in and stood in the inner doorway, looking at the two of them. "Thank you," he said, to both of them, but in ways that were slightly different. Martha waved her hand in a gesture that dismissed the word. Clara looked at him in a way that dismissed nothing, but also didn't ask for anything. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "Restock the firewood, check the ducts, prepare for the next one. And beyond that?" He thought for a moment. "Professor Arthur let it slip that he wants to write something about my grandfather's notebook, about the technique. I think it should happen." Clara nodded slowly. "For generations that knowledge almost got lost," she said. "If it gets lost now after all this, it'll be the biggest waste possible." "It won't get lost," Silas said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't boastfulness. It was certainty. The weeks that followed the great storm were, in many ways, more transformative than the cold days themselves. Clifford was the first to knock on Silas's door, asking to better understand how the stone system worked. He showed up on a Saturday afternoon with a cup of coffee for himself, like someone wanting to keep their hands busy while asking questions they were still learning to formulate. "Can you show me how you calculated the thickness of the stones?" he asked. Silas showed him. He opened the notebook, pointed to the calculations, explained the reasoning behind them. Clifford listened with an attention that Silas hadn't fully expected. "My cabin would need a remodel anyway," Clifford said after a while. "Maybe it makes sense to do it right. I can help you, help. And I can make up for what I didn't do during your mother's work bee." Clifford said that, looking to the side, not turning it into a big deal, but not letting it slide either. "It doesn't have to be like that. For me it does." He was the kind of man who settled things that way. Silas respected that. In the following days, a few more showed up. Young Grant, in his 20s and building his first house, asked if Silas would mind going over the process with him again. Mrs. Gertrude, the same one who had been the first to use the word lunacy, showed up at the door with a piece of cornbread and an "I came to thank you" that was more of a confession than a thank you. Clara, who had thought about the educational aspect from the start, suggested something that took Silas a few days to accept: an open meeting at his house, where he could show the notebook and explain what he had done, not as proof of anything, as a transfer of knowledge. "I'm not a teacher," he said. "You're what your grandfather was, someone who knows something others need to know." She paused. "I can help with the explaining part. You just need to show what you did." It was a division of labor that made sense, and it was also a way for Clara to take part in that, in a way that was genuinely hers. Not as support for someone else's project, but as someone bringing something of her own. The meeting happened on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after the storm. More than 30 people came. The hall of Silas's cabin couldn't hold them all, so part of the conversation took place outside, with the stone walls as a backdrop and the snow-covered mountains in the distance. Arthur had come back especially for that afternoon. He sat in a wooden chair in the corner, and when Clara introduced him, he stood up with that teacher's posture that never fully fades. "I knew the father of these ideas," he said, pointing to the notebook Silas was holding. "And I can say with technical knowledge that what's in that notebook isn't folklore. It's engineering. Engineering that academia spent decades ignoring because it didn't fit into academia's categories. But nature doesn't care about academia's categories." There was laughter from the audience, the kind of laughter that comes when someone says out loud what people already felt but hadn't put into words. Silas showed the walls, explained the ducts, passed the notebook from hand to hand. People touched the stones, felt the temperature, asked questions ranging from the most practical to the most philosophical. An older woman with white hair, whom he didn't know well, held the notebook for a long time, looking over the notes with an expression that mixed nostalgia and admiration. "My husband was like that," she said, handing the notebook back. "A man who kept what he learned with care. When he was gone, that went with him. It hurts to think about it." Silas didn't quite know what to say, but he placed the notebook in front of her again. "You can look more." She looked, and she kept looking for a good while. Sterling showed up at the end of the afternoon when most had already left. He hadn't been explicitly invited, but he also hadn't been excluded. He arrived alone without his hat, hands in his coat pockets, and stopped in front of the stone walls like someone seeing something for the first time, even though he'd looked before. "I made a big mistake," he said, without looking at Silas. "And I want you to know that I know it." "You already said that inside the house," Silas replied. "I know. But I wanted to say it again, out here, where there are fewer people to hear me." Sterling paused. "When there are fewer people, it feels more honest." Silas considered that. "You wanted me to stop because I was doing something you didn't understand," he said. "And when you don't understand, sometimes you get mad at the person who does." Sterling looked at him. It was a formulation that neither absolved nor accused, and maybe that's why it came closest to the truth. "That's a good way to explain it," he said. "It's one possible way. There are others." The older man was silent for a moment. Then, "Are you going to teach more people to do this? The walls?" "If people want to learn. I do." The statement came out direct, without ornament. "I want at least to understand. I have a few properties that could benefit." There was a genuine change there. Silas knew the difference between a man being strategic and a man who'd been changed by something. Sterling seemed like the second type now. "It starts with the notebook," Silas said, "and with the patience to understand before you build." Sterling nodded. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the night cold settled back over Stone Hollow, Clara stood beside Silas, leaning against the stone wall. The warmth coming from it was subtle but real even from the outside, from the yum. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That my grandfather would laugh at all this?" "How?" "His way. Quiet and satisfied." Clara was silent for a moment. Then, "Do you think he knew it would turn out like this?" Silas thought. "I don't know if he knew, but I think he trusted." Pause. "That the stone would do what stone does, and that people would understand when they needed to understand." The moon was rising behind the highest mountain, large and silver. There was a stillness in the village that wasn't emptiness. It was the kind of silence that comes after something important has happened. Silas looked at the cabin walls, at the stones he'd carried one by one from the river, at the joints he'd patiently adjusted over months, at the mortar seams that had cured slowly while laughter ran through the village, and he thought of his grandfather with that thread of a voice and that strong hand. The stone knows the difference. It did. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to hit the like button and most importantly subscribe to the channel. That helps us beginners a lot. Now, continuing. Spring arrived with the slowness of mountain springs. First, the snow receded from the lower slopes. Then mud replaced the white, and green began to appear in timid patches that grew larger each passing week. The river swelled again, carrying melted snow from the heights, and the village children returned to play along its banks on sunny afternoons. Silas went to the river one such afternoon to gather new stones, not for his own cabin, which was complete, for Clifford's cabin, construction on which had begun 3 weeks earlier. Clifford had partially dismantled the eastern wall, the most exposed to the wind, and was rebuilding it with stones from the same riverbed Silas had used. The two worked together most days, sharing the particular ease of people who discover they understand each other better by doing something than by trying to talk. That afternoon, as they chose stones along the bank, Clifford was quiet for a while before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "About Clara." Clifford paused, as if choosing his words with the same care he used to pick stones. "She stopped by early this week, returning a pot she'd borrowed from Mrs. Martha, and the way she talked about you—" Silas didn't answer right away. He kept examining a stone, testing its weight. "What way?" he finally said. "The way of someone who doesn't talk about you like you're part of the world around them. She talks like you're part of the center." It was an observation Clifford had phrased better than Silas expected. "We haven't talked about it yet," Silas said, "but you'll have to talk at some point." "I will." Clifford let out a short laugh. "Just don't take too long. Life doesn't wait for you to finish building to start happening." It was advice Silas took to heart. Later that same week, one afternoon when Clara had stopped by the cabin, bringing more notes she'd made on the building technique for a project she was preparing, the two of them sat at the kitchen table after the work was done. The lamp was lit because it was getting dark early, and the kitchen smelled of the coffee Silas had made, but they hadn't touched yet. She spoke first. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. I'm here. When I pulled away, back at the beginning, after the meeting, did you notice?" Silas looked at her. "I noticed." "And what did you think?" "I thought it was easier to side with whoever's winning, and that you'd come back when things got clearer." She was silent for a moment. It wasn't the silence of someone hurt. It was the silence of someone processing the honesty she had asked for, and had received exactly as requested. "You were right and you were wrong," she finally said. "I didn't pull away because I thought you were losing. I pulled away because I was scared." "Of what?" "Of caring about what happens to you." She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. "When you start truly caring about someone, what happens to them starts to hurt too, and I spent a long time trying not to let that happen." "Because of what happened before you came to Stone Hollow?" Silas asked. She looked up. "You knew." "I knew you'd left some place for some reason. I didn't know the details. But the way you protect yourself with your arms crossed when you're close to something that matters, that's not a habit that comes from nowhere." Clara looked at him for a time that was hard to measure. "It was a man I thought understood who I was," she said, "and who woke up one day and decided that the version of me he'd imagined didn't match the real one." She paused. "I learned to distrust when I start to matter." "I understand that," Silas said. "Are you scared too?" He thought about it. It was an honest question that deserved an honest answer. "I'm scared of promising things I can't keep. I always have been. That's why I make few promises." He looked at her. "But when I do, I keep them." The silence that settled after that was of a particular kind. It was the silence of two people who had just exchanged something real and were letting it land before deciding what to do with it. In the end, neither of them said anything more on the subject that night, but when Clara left, she didn't cross her arms at the door, and Silas stood there watching her go longer than he had realized. Summer brought heat and movement. Arthur came back in June with a draft of a text he'd written about the notebook of Silas's grandfather. It was a long document, with photos the old professor had taken himself during the visit, with the notebook's notes reproduced in detail and commented on with the technical perspective of decades of experience. "I want to publish this," he said, sitting at the table with Silas. "Not in a newspaper, in a bulletin about regional construction techniques that a group of researchers maintains. It won't reach many people, but it'll reach the right people, folks who could use it. And my grandfather's name. Your grandfather's name will appear prominently, as it should." Silas held the draft in his hands for a long time. There was something very particular about reading what someone else had written about his grandfather's work. It was like seeing the old man from an angle he himself had never had access to. "You can publish it," he said. "There's one more thing," Arthur said. "The text mentions you too. The fact that you had the courage to use the notebook. That's just as important as what's in the notebook, Silas. Knowledge nobody uses is dead letter. You brought it to life." It was the most direct and hardest thing to receive that anyone had said to Silas in all those months. He nodded without speaking, because that was the only answer he could give at that moment. In the following months, something started building in Stone Hollow, in a way that didn't follow any formal plan. There was no organization. There was no declared leadership. There were simply people who had spent 2 nights inside a stone cabin, feeling a warmth they had never felt, and who returned to their own homes with a question that wouldn't leave their heads. What if we'd done it this way from the start? Clifford was the first to finish his renovation. It took 6 weeks of work, with Silas's help on the more technical parts and from other neighbors who showed up from time to time. When the last stone was set and the internal heating system tested, Clifford stood still, staring at the wall with an expression Silas recognized. It was the look of someone who has just made something that will outlast them. "My father built this cabin 40 years ago," Clifford said. "He'd be surprised." "Or not," Silas said. "Maybe he knew, like my grandfather knew, and just didn't have anyone to carry it on." Clifford considered that. "Then we carry it on for them." It was a way of thinking about time that Silas had inherited from his grandfather, not as a line that goes only one way, but as something that loops back to pick up what was left behind. Young Grant finished the foundation of his first house with river stones and spent weeks asking questions that Silas answered with the patience of someone who has learned there's no useless question when the question is honest. Mrs. Margaret, who had spent so many hours inside Silas's cabin during the storm, was the biggest surprise. She showed up one afternoon with an unexpected proposal. She wanted the back wall of her little house renovated with stones, but she didn't want to ask anyone to do it for her. She wanted to learn how to do it herself. Silas paused for a moment. "Mrs. Margaret, it's heavy work." "I know it is, but I've spent my whole life letting others handle my things, and then feeling dependent. I want to learn at least the part I can manage." There was a dignity in that statement that allowed no refusal. They started the following week. Mrs. Margaret, 65 years old, with shoulders that weren't what they used to be, learned how to choose the stones, mix the mortar, test the fit before setting them in place. She wasn't fast, but she was steady, and there was a concentration in the way she worked that Silas had only seen in people doing something that means more than it seems. One afternoon, as they were laying the 3rd row, she mentioned in passing, "My husband would be jealous that I'm learning this." Silas didn't understand right away. Jealous? He loved to build, but he never let me near when he worked. Said it was a man's thing. She stopped, looked at the stone she was holding. A man's thing, as if the stone could tell whose hand it came from. It was a remark that lingered. Silas didn't say anything, but he kept thinking about it for days. By the end of summer, what had started as a solitary project in a cabin had turned into something different and bigger, not by proclamation, but by an accumulation of small choices. It was an August morning when Silas climbed up to the quarry by the river and found there, to his surprise, Clifford, young Grant, and 2 more neighbors whose names he knew but had never worked with. They were picking stones. "Who's that for?" he asked. "For old man Oswald," Clifford said. "The old man lives alone. The north wall is already rotting. We decided to help." Silas looked at the group. "Do you need me?" "We need you to come check the structure first," Grant said. "After that, we'll know what to do." It was a small but real shift. People were no longer waiting for Silas. They were going after the stones themselves and asking Silas to come handle the technical part. The knowledge had begun to move on its own. Old man Oswald was 81 years old and had a history in the village that predated most people there. When the group arrived with the stones and tools, the old man was sitting on the porch with an expression that mixed surprise and a careful dignity. You didn't have to go through the trouble, he said. It's no trouble, Clifford replied. It's a community effort. The word hung in the air with a weight that wasn't heavy. It was more like the sound of something returning to the place it should have always been. Silas passed by Oswald's construction site several times in the following days, checking, adjusting, answering questions. But the work itself was done by the others. And there was a peace in that which he hadn't anticipated. The fact that his grandfather's notebook was in a way being copied into other people's hands. Not literally, but in the sense that mattered. Clara documented everything. Not with a camera or a recorder, but with written notes in her own little notebook, which she had started carrying after the Saturday meeting. She had developed a sort of record of the techniques as they were applied, with questions she asked Silas and the others, with her own observations about the process. It was a document in the making, which she still didn't know exactly what it would become, but it kept growing. "What's this going to be?" Silas asked one afternoon, carefully flipping through the pages of her notebook. "I don't know yet," she said. "Maybe material for the kids, real. Maybe something the community can use as a reference. Maybe nothing more than a record that one day someone will find and wonder where it came from. Like my grandfather's notebook." Exactly like your grandfather's notebook. It was a continuity neither of them had planned, but which had emerged with the naturalness of things that have roots. One September afternoon, when autumn was already beginning to show its first signs in those mountains, Silas was sitting on the porch of his house when Clara appeared with 2 jars of jam she had made. "Blackberry jam," she said, placing one on the table. "The other is from Old Man Oswald. He sent word that the wall turned out well, and that you have jam credit for as long as you want." Silas looked at the jar. "He makes jam." He used to, actually. He had stopped. But with the renovation done, he said he got the urge to do the things he likes again. She sat down in the chair next to him. "This has a name, you know. When an environment changes people's state of mind." "What name?" "Several, depending on who explains it. But what matters is that Old Man Oswald started making jam again." Silas stared at the jar for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "Clara." "Are you going to stay in Stone Hollow?" The question came out more direct than he had planned. But the point had been reached where directness was the only path that made sense. She looked at him. "Why do you ask?" "Because I want to know, not as a passing question, as a real question." She was silent for a moment. There was an expression on her face that was both vulnerable and resolute, which was in a way the synthesis of who she was. "I came to Stone Hollow because I needed a place that was real," she said, "a place where the things that matter still matter, where a stone wall can change an entire community's winter." A pause. "This place is it. So yes, I'm staying." Silas nodded. It was the answer he had been waiting for, but hearing it carries a different weight than imagining it. "Then I guess we can continue that conversation we started in the kitchen someday," he said. "I guess so." She didn't cross her arms. And the September afternoon sun in those mountains hit the stone wall of the cabin with a light that made them look almost golden. Winter returned, as it always does. But this time, Stone Hollow was different. There was no grand ceremony, no proclamations. There were simply 4 cabins in the village that now had walls covered in stone. There was a duct system that Clifford had adapted to his own configuration, with Arthur's help by correspondence. There was a young man in his 20s who had spent the summer learning to mix mortar and who had built on his own the side wall of his first house. There was a teacher with a little notebook full of notes that the schoolchildren had already started to know, because she had taken some pages to show in class, and the children had spent an entire afternoon drawing stone houses on paper. There was an 81-year-old man who was making blackberry jam again, and there was a hardcover notebook, yellowed and worn, which rested in a wooden box under Silas's bed, but which now came out much more often. It was consulted, copied in parts, explained, discussed. It was doing in many hands what the grandfather had said it would do, serving. On the first night of serious cold of the new winter, Silas lit the stove early, as he had done the year before. He sat in the center of the room for a while, feeling the heat distribute through the walls and return, the same feeling as always, the memory of the stone. But this time there was no weight of loneliness in that moment. There was a continuity. Across the street, Clifford's cabin had its light on. Up the hillside, Mrs. Margaret's little house had the new back wall she had learned to build herself. Farther away, Grant's house under construction had the stone foundation that would withstand winters he didn't yet know. And Clara, who had stayed for dinner and was washing the cups in the kitchen, was humming a low tune that Silas didn't recognize, but that sounded good in that space. He picked up his grandfather's notebook, opened it to the last page, to the one with letters bigger than usual. The cold is not an enemy. The cold is a teacher. It teaches who built to last and who built to look good. The stone knows the difference. He closed the notebook. He looked at the walls. The stone knew. End of story. Tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. Do you think Silas was right to insist to the end? Leave your opinion in the comments, hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories like this one.